continue on with our story around the giants to the theme of dread not, for God goes before. We said in our exhortation that there were many faithful who encountered different giants in the scripture. Here's a little bit of a list of some of the named giants and where they occur. This is not every single giant, but they're the main ones that people are interested in. And we're going to look at a few of these different stories together this week. The first mention of giants is in Genesis 6 verse 4. It might be worth flicking over there. If we follow passages this afternoon, at least it'll keep the blood in our fingertips moving and something will stay awake. So let's go to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, where we find the very first mention of giants in the Bible, where it says there were giants in the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Giants. In the Hebrew, the word there is Nephilim. And that word has this root meaning to fall. But the word's so ancient that no one really knows whether the word was intended to indicate terrifying warriors who felled all before them, like warrior lumberjacks, or whether they themselves were the fallen, apostates, fallen away from the truth of the family of God. The Nephilim are described here as being the product of and the children of marriages between the family of Seth, known as the sons of God, and the spawn of Cain, the daughters of men. And it appears that either way we read this word Nephilim, it holds truth. For these famous mighty men before the flood, and the word there is Ha-Gibborim, mighty men, were very clearly the key contributors to God's assessment of the earth in verse 5, where it says that God saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth. These men were violent, apostate, fallen fellas of their fellow men. The word Nephilim only shows up once more in the whole of the Bible. But its use gives us a much clearer picture of what made these Nephilim, these Ha-Gibborim, these fallen mighty champions, what made them significant. And it's our reading this afternoon, and thank you for reading that for us. Numbers 13 and verse 33. The only other time in the Bible that this phrase occurs, and it says in Numbers 13:33, for those with a lovely wide margin Oxford 205, it says, and there we saw the giants, the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which came of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Numbers 13:33. So here we're being told that in Hebron, because that's where the 12 spies are at this point, they saw Nephilim. They saw the sons of one Anak. And these sons of Anak were the descendants of the Nephilim. Which they can't have been, can they? Because, like, the Nephilim, they all died in the flood, didn't they? Every single last one of them. There wasn't one hanging to the outside of the ark, made it through somehow. Didn't happen. They're clearly not the genetic descendants of the Nephilim of Noah's time. That's not who the spies are seeing in Numbers 13, is it? All of them are dead. And yet still, there must have been something about these inhabitants of Hebron observed by these spies from a safe distance outside Hebron's walls. There must have been something there that evoked old stories and ancient memories. What detail do you think it was? What was it that the 10 spies noted about these distant figures striding about Hebron's fortifications that filled them with terror. Well, they say it themselves, don't they? They say it in this very verse. As a grasshopper is to a man, so we felt before them, and so they must have looked upon us. The thing that terrified the 12 spies was the immense size of the 3 warriors on those walls. That's what horrified them. And presumably, this was obvious to them because somehow these 3 warriors on the walls of Hebron, and there may have even been more, were contrasted, were able to be compared against other normal-sized warriors on the battlements there in Hebron. Perhaps they could see and contrast. Oh, normal-sized person, normal-sized... What? How tall is that one? How did they know what tribe these 3 belonged to? Because they say it here, don't they? They say they're the sons of Anak. I mean, if you think about it, they haven't talked to them, have they? It's very unlikely that the spies walked up to the gates of Hebron and said, "Oh, excuse me, gentlemen, we're just looking up at your walls. Those gentlemen up there, who's their dad?" It didn't happen like that, did it? How would they know who they were without seeing them up close? Well, everybody knew who they were. This is what it says elsewhere in Deuteronomy. Moses says, "Go in and possess the land. And you'll see there are people great and tall, the children of the anakims, whom thou sawest, and of whom thou hast heard. Who can stand before the children of Anak?" It was legendary. The Egyptians knew about the anakims. Ancient Egyptian records talk about the giants that they witnessed in the land of Israel. And there was a proverb, "Oh, no one can stand against the son of Anak." And so when you saw someone incredibly tall on the walls, you just knew. You knew who it was going to be. You didn't need to introduce yourself and ask a polite question. And so they looked there and they saw these giants. And clearly in the minds of the spies, Noah's Nephilim had been giants, and these terrifying figures on Hebron's walls are giants. Noah's giants were Nephilim, and therefore these ones must be Nephilim too. There's some sort of equivalence going on in their minds. Moses, in writing Genesis, clearly saw a connection also. For even though the old Nephilim of the flood had died, he noted in Genesis that there would be Nephilim again. He says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also after this, therefore after the flood. Somehow Noah saw some sort of connection between the Nephilim of prior to the flood and the giants after the flood. How was that? Well, I think he knew that once again there would be giant heroes of apostate violence striding the world after the flood. He wasn't wrong, was he? But I think there's another connection between the Nephilim of Noah's time and the giants of Moses' time. Because you see, there's another word that's used to describe the giants. Flick across, please, to Deuteronomy chapter 2. And in case you're wondering, yes, this is a little bit of background. Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 10. And it says, Deuteronomy 2 and verse 10, "The Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many and tall, as tall as the anakims." As tall as the anakims. You see, the Emims, whoever they were accounted to be giants like the Anakim because they were great and tall. Except that the word here giants, the Hebrew word, doesn't actually mean giants in this verse. It's not Nephilim, it's a different word. In fact, almost every other version of the Bible you choose to look up says in this verse, as the Rephaim. The anakims were as tall and as terrifying as the Rephaim. And that word, Rephaim, well, it comes from a root that means to drop down, as though dead. You know, round and round the rosies, a ring of posies, a tissue, we all drop down. That one. It's drop down dead. It's that idea. So Rephaim comes from this idea of to fall as if dead. And in many places in the Bible, it is actually translated as the dead or the shades of the dead ones. And I think that's the point. You see, in these giants, people saw a shade. They saw a ghost, as it were, of all that had died in the flood, all of the mighty wickedness, the giant crimes of before the flood. And when they looked at giants, they were seeing almost, as it were, an echo, a ghost of all that had died back then and all that had led the world to catastrophe. And yet here they were, like creatures climbing out of the grave. God had killed them all, and still they lived. The giants had died, they caused the flood, but yet here they are, and they can see them. The Rapha, the sons of the dead Nephilim. And I think that's the connection. I think that's what people were seeing. And so it's little wonder that when the 10 spies saw the anakim, they were horrified. I say 10 because 2 of them weren't horrified, and we'll talk about that. It was early July, and Israel, led by Moses, had reached the edge of the wilderness. They were camped at Kadesh on the southern edge of the Promised Land, the bottom of the range of those ever-climbing steps of hills that rise away towards the north, peaking at Hebron, the city where the covenant faithful, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, had all been rolled together in the grave, awaiting the kingdom. That special place, that sacred ground to every Israelite. And the Promised Land was now so close, their inheritance just brief hours' march away. The wilderness was just behind them. Come back one page to Deuteronomy chapter 1, where it says in verse 19, "And when we departed from Horeb, we went through all that great and terrible wilderness, which ye saw by the way of the mountain of the Amorites, as the Lord our God commanded us, and we came to Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you are come unto the mountain of the Amorites, which the Lord our God doth give unto us." The Promised Land is right there. And he says unto them, verse 21, "Behold, the Lord your God has set the land before thee. Go and possess it, as the Lord your God of your fathers have said unto you. Fear not." Don't be discouraged. Note that little phrase. Don't be afraid. Fear not. You see, Moses clearly anticipated that they would need all of their courage. They would need their faith. He anticipated that the conquest of the Promised Land would hold existential threats for them. Verse 29, "Then I said unto you, dread not, neither be afraid of them. The Lord your God, which goeth before you, he will fight for you." He's saying, look, don't be afraid. And I'm telling you this because I know you will be afraid. And when you feel afraid, remember what I told you not to be afraid, because God is with you. Dread not. Now, it's the people themselves who suggested that they survey the land prior to entering into it. Verse 22, "You came near unto me, all of you. You were the ones who said to me, we will send men before us, and they'll search out the land, and they'll bring us word again by which way to go up and what cities we should conquest." God agreed with that idea, but it was their idea. And on the surface, it sounded like a great idea. Let's just send some people up, They'll map out a route for us. They'll work out which are the best freeways, where the parking lots are, where the petrol stations are. We'll make it really smooth. That's how we'll do it. But you see, God knew what they would see. He knew what they would see when they went up. He knew already what the spies were going to see on that journey through the land. But it was up to them how they reacted. God knew already they were going to see the cast of nightmares. They were going to see the shades of those long dead sinners guarding the heartland of the promise, standing right there at Hebron, the holiest place for them at that point in time. Well, up went the spies. They stuck to the concealment of the craggy heights, fearful of being recognized and hunted. They marched and they marched till they reached the very border of Syria in the far north of the land. And then they turned south, and now disguised by their route, by the fact they're traveling south and not north, safe that they won't be identified with that savage crowd who have escaped out of Egypt and are heading from the south. They can pose as visitors from the non-threatening north. And so they explored the land that God had promised. And Numbers chapter 13 tells us that there were two events of note in their route back south. Let's go there. Numbers 13. Now, how are we going? Are the dozers settling in? Oh, it's tricky sometimes. A giant of sleep stalks us all, I think. I'm lucky. I can just take a sip of water, even if I bore myself. But yeah, you just have to put up with me. So whatever you need to do it. Alrighty. Numbers 13. Verse 22. Here's the first of those important events on the trip back south. They ascended by the south and came unto Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the children of Anak, were. They saw three giants on Hebron's battlements. And this event is directly contrasted with another event. Verse 23, they came unto the brook Eshcol and cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes that required they bear it between two upon a staff. And they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. They found a cluster of grapes so large it took two to carry it at Eshcol. Wonderful proof of the fruitfulness of the land that God had promised. A giant cluster of grapes. Yet where they found this cluster of grapes is almost as important as what they actually found. Because Eshcol means a cluster, e.g., of grapes. It's presumably named for this discovery of this vast bunch of grapes. At a place called a cluster of grapes, they found grapes. And you might think, well, so what? Well, you see, the name Eshcol shows up in the context of the 12 spies and only one other place in the whole of the scripture. Let's go there. Genesis 14. The only other place this name shows up. And, often that's a bit of a marker. It's a pointer, isn't it? It's the scripture saying, dig here. See what you'll find. Genesis chapter 14 and verse 13. And it says, and there came one that escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of a friend of his, Mamre the Amorite, who was the brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. These were confederate with Abraham. So Abraham's living at Mamre, that is Hebron, and he's confederate with some Amorites. And the word confederate here means breakers of bread. He broke bread with a group of men, including one called Eshcol. And you know what Abraham, Eshcol, and the others he's confederate with do in this chapter? Well, together with 318 men, they tracked down a vast army that has just done a complete circuit of the Promised Land, wiping out tribe after tribe of giants. Verse 5, and it says, in the 14th year came Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and they smote the Rephaims, the shades of the dead ones, in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims, another group of giants, and the Emims, another group of giants, and the Horites, another group of giants. Tribe after tribe of giants fall before this army. And Abraham and Eshcol and his company destroy this army that was far stronger than 4 whole tribes of giants. They rescue Lot and they head off to Jerusalem to meet up with Melchizedek. That's what this chapter's about. And just after seeing a group of giants in the very place that Abraham and Eshcol lived together, the spies get proof that the promised land is all that God promised at the very place that just happens to be named after a giant killer. I hope that made sense. Isn't that remarkable? At the very place named after a man who fought and won against an army that could kill whole tribes of giants, they found proof that God's covenant would be fulfilled and more so. You see, God knew what they would see. He knew they were going to see giants. But how they responded was up to them. I think the lesson of that is not something I need to tell you about. So the spies return, and let's go back to Numbers chapter 13 and see what the spies say in verse 27. Numbers 13, verse 27. They give their report, and here it is. They came back to Moses and they told him, and they said, we came into the land which you sent us to look to. Actually, he didn't. That was their idea, but we'll leave that there. And surely it flows with milk and honey. Look at the fruit of it. Everything God said is completely true. It's all true. It is a promised land flowing with milk and honey. But, there's always a but, isn't there? Verse 28, underline that word. Nevertheless, it's just a long way of saying but. But the people be strong that dwell in the land. The cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. Well, that's a bit of a downer, but it's accurate. The people were strong. The cities were walled. Why? The walls of Lachish were, in some places, 8 meters thick. I mean, that's a thick wall by anyone's standard. And yes, there were giants. There's nothing incorrect in what they've said. Verse 30, and Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. Caleb speaks. And you can see what's happened. At the mention of the giants, a murmur has gone through the people. Anak, and everyone's whispering, Anak, the anakims. Oh, and this murmur, like a wave, washes through the people. And Caleb stands up and says, hold it. We are well able, brothers and sisters, to overcome. With God on our side, we will take the promised land. And he stills them. His words stop that murmur. You can see people settling back into their seats. They're okay. Yes, he's right. Verse 31, but the men that went up with Caleb said, beg to differ, Caleb. I think you're completely wrong. Far be it from me to undermine the report of another spy, but I think that's rubbish. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. That's how they responded to what they saw. It wasn't look, it'll be difficult, or even let's not rush into this. Maybe we'll form a couple of subcommittees and hash the idea through for a week or two. No, it wasn't that. It was, we cannot. And worse, verse 32, they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eats up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. Every single man, jack of them, is a giant. We never saw anyone under 15 feet, easily, maybe 20. This is a land that swallows people. Most of them are giants. And verse 33, there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, that came of the giants, and we were in our sight like grasshoppers, and so were we in their sight. The problem is what they saw. They saw 3 vast figures on Hebron's walls, and now everyone looked like a giant to them, and their terrors, they were growing and they were multiplying. The monsters came crawling out from underneath the bed, and everywhere they looked, there were things that swallowed up people, and we'll all die. Little wonder that in chapter 14, verse 1, all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept all night. The whole camp had nightmares, and in every corner of the camp, you can hear someone getting rocked back to sleep. Don't worry. We'll talk to Moses in the morning. Verse 2, and all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, would God we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in the wilderness? Anything would be better than this. Amazing. 3 giants, and suddenly death was better. And wherefore hath Yahweh brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt and to slavery? And they said to one another, let us make a captain and we'll go back to Egypt. All of us, come on, let's turn around, pack your bags, we're going. So they start looking for a captain, and by verse 10, the congregation bade stone them with stones. They're ready to stone Moses, Joshua, and Caleb to death. And the only thing that saves those 3 men on this occasion is the sudden appearance of something very, very familiar, and yet somehow far more arresting. A cloudy pillar of fire twisting away above them into the sky so high, taller than them, taller than giants, taller than Hebron's walls, twisting into the heavens, a reminder of all that they had forgotten, that they walked with a living God. And in their fear and in their terror, they had forgotten the sound of sobbing Egyptians. They had forgotten those walls of Red Sea water, taller than any giant, a shark halfway out of it, not sure what was happening. They had forgotten their victory over Amalek. They had forgotten water from the rock and bread from the sky. They'd forgotten. And giants do that, don't they, brothers and sisters? The problems we face in our week make us forget that God resurrects the dead. He saves the unsavable. He does miracles both then and today. But we forget. But Caleb didn't. Verse 9, only rebel ye not against the Lord. Neither fear the people of the land. They're bread for us, he says. Their defense is departed from them. Lord is with us. Fear them not. God's with us, not them. And he says, look, they're bread for us. And you think, well, what does that mean? Well, what did the wilderness bread do? Well, it came from heaven and it melted in the sunlight, didn't it? They left it out too long and the bread that they'd eaten would just melt away. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, look, they're like bread. We leave them out too long, they'll just melt before us. And Caleb's saying, why would we fear this people when we have a living God on our side? But you see, for God, this was the final straw. Rather than remember how God had rescued them from all their fears, they allowed what they'd not even personally seen. Only 10, 12 people had seen these giants. But they allowed what they saw in their mind's eye to conquer their faith. The nation hadn't seen giants, and yet now they were seeing giants that were taller than God. And God says, it's enough. Verse 22, all these men which have seen my glory, you saw my glory, and you saw my miracles, which I did in Egypt and I did in the wilderness, and you've tempted me now 10 times. You haven't listened to what I've said. Fine, you couldn't see me. You will not see the land which I swear to your fathers. None of you that provoked me will see it. And for the next 40 years, their desiccated corpses would fall like autumn leaves from the tree. Their lifespans artificially shortened, their aging accelerated till none over 20 on that fateful day in Kadesh survived, save Moses and Caleb and Joshua. For 40 years, they were going to wander the wilderness, completely safe from giants, but ravaged by God's wrath. Would God that we'd died in the wilderness, they said, and so they did. But now that generation is dead. Let's move forward. Let's move forward and follow Moses now, because Moses begins to prepare the nation for the conquest of the promised land 40 years later. That was quite an abrupt segue, wasn't it? 40 years. Chapter 21. Numbers 21, verse 10. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in Oboth. And they journeyed from Oboth and pitched in Jeabirim in the wilderness, which is before Moab, toward the sun rising. They're now traveling up the eastern side of the Dead Sea. Verse 21, Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, on the eastern side of the Jordan there, and said, let me pass through thy land. We will not turn into the fields or into the vineyards. We will not drink of the waters of the well. We will go along the king's highway until we be past thy borders. So they plead with Sihon that they could just pass through his land. They won't touch it. But Sihon would not suffer Israel to pass through his border. Sihon gathered his people together and went out against Israel into the wilderness, came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Verse 24, and Israel smote him with the edge of the sword. Here's the first battle of the new generation. It's not a battle they choose to have. It's one that's forced on them by Sihon. It's one of defense, it's not one of attack. And of course, God is with them. It's a victory. So what, if that wasn't a sort of intentional battle, what was their first conquest, their first intentional battle? Well, verse 33. They turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. And the Lord said unto Moses, Fear him not, for I have delivered him into thy hand and all his people and his land, and thou shalt do to him as thou dost unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt at Heshbon. So they smote him and his sons and all his people until there was none left alive, and they possessed his land. Pretty straightforward. Short, sharp, almost no detail. And yet I'm sure you noticed that little phrase there. Verse 34, fear him not. Why would Moses fear Og? After all, they just defeated Sihon. Easy. Piece of cake. Well, come across to Deuteronomy chapter 3. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 1. Parallel record. And then we turned and went up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. The Lord said unto me, fear him not, for I will deliver him and all his people and his land into thy hand, and thou shalt do unto it. It's the same story, isn't it? Look at verse 11. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth thereof, after the common cubit, the cubit of a man. He's got a bedstead 9 cubits high. All right. So, on average, the person who sleeps in a bed is slightly shorter than the bed, right? It's no good being longer than the bed because then your feet hang out and get cold. If you're exactly the same size as the bed, you might find yourself getting wedged in. It's good to be a little bit shorter than the bed. So let's assume that if he's got a 9-cubit bedstead, he was 1 cubit less than his bedstead. How big does that make? Well, that makes him 8 cubits, right? I know it's hard doing maths at this point in the afternoon, but 9 minus 1, 8. 8 cubits tall. So if he was 8 cubits tall, how tall was he? Well, Josh, this is your moment. Do you want to stand up for me? Joshua is not 8 cubits tall, but we use Joshua as an excellent contrast. Can you see the second cross, the one right up there? The top cross? Joshua for scale, and maybe just go down the steps and stand on the floor for us, Joshua, because it is actually measured from there. That's the height of Og, king of Bashan. Now, I know Joshua's a bit of a shrimp. I should have picked someone taller, but nonetheless, it makes the point. Thank you so much for that, Joshua. Really appreciate that. 13 feet tall. And you might wonder what's so important about his bed that made it worth mentioning. Why not just say, and Og was 13 feet tall? Why say in such a roundabout way his bed was 9 cubits? Well, you see, we're still presumably deep in the Bronze Age at this point. Maybe the late Bronze Age, but it's still the Bronze Age at this point in time. To have any iron at all was really something. Like, people didn't have iron. That's kind of why it's called the Bronze Age, right? And so to have an iron bed, well, that's really showing off. Like, that would be like me today saying, yeah, my bed's made of titanium. Whole bed of titanium, what do you reckon? I mean, you just wouldn't do it, would you? No one would pay the extra money to have a titanium bed. You would only spend the amount of money to have a titanium, or in this case, an iron bed, if you actually needed it. And you see, I think Og needed it. Because I'm sure, you may have looked at the standard BMI chart. Now, BMI chart sort of tops out at about 7 foot, 136 kilos if you're overweight, 110 kilos if you're on weight. But if you just kind of extend that up and up and up to the height we need him to be, move it all the way up to about 4 meters tall, you'll find that at the very least he weighed 218 kilograms. But that's assuming that we just stretch him tall and thin like a lumberjack basketballer. If he was more well proportioned like a normal man rather than just stretched, he probably weighed somewhere in the vicinity of 1/2 ton. That's why he needed an iron bed, brothers and sisters. And that's why it was kept in the museum in Rabath of the children of Ammon, so that everyone could come and have a look at this enormous iron bed that Og had to have because he kept on breaking wooden ones. And you see, it wasn't just Og. Numbers 21 verse 35, we don't need to go back there, tells us that Og had sons. Plural. Now we don't know how many, but sons means, right, at least 2, right? Maybe more, but at least 2, which means there were at least 3 individuals who were pretty big that had to be fought in this particular battle. And verse 1 adds another little detail because it says that Og left his capital city of Ashtaroth-Karnaim, we get that from the other record, to fight at a place called Edrei. They might say, well, why did he choose to fight at Edrei? Why not? I mean, surely normally what you do if you're a king is you make sure your capital city is the one that's best fortified, and that's where you want to fight your big battles, because that's where all the guns are. Why do it at Edrei? Well, I think it's this. It's a bit hard to tell, but this is from an old book from the 1880s, Across the Jordan by, probably some of you have read it, Gottlieb Schumacher, favourite of some of yours I'm sure, and Lawrence Oliphant, 1886. And what it's picturing is a little map or schematic they drew at Edrei. I might say, well, what are we looking at there? I can't quite, that looks like the intestinal tract of a donkey. Is that what it is? No, you see, Edrei was a massively fortified fortress, but get this, it had an entirely subterranean fortress that they had built underground. Think about what that means for just a minute. Moses defeated a 13-foot monster, 2 of his sons, all of his army, and in all likelihood, this battle was conducted in an underground fortress in which your enemy knew every twist, every turn, every pitfall, every trap, and as soon as you got in, they switched off the lights. This truly is the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? A 13-foot monster in an underground dungeon. And the record says, so the Lord our God delivered into our hands Og, also the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote them until none of them left remaining. That's it. You see, fighting giants is all about fear. Giants are only scary because we make them huge in our minds. And in the dark, and in our doubt, and in our stress, and in our worry, we make them bigger and larger than life. And as we sit there and we stew on these problems, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what giants are. Things that we make big and scary in our minds. The things that grow more and more threatening the more we think about them. We said earlier this morning that the night wolves and those sorts of things faded and shrunk under the scrutiny of our adult eyes, and we put them away in the toy box of our childish fears and fancies. But our giants are real, aren't they? We're fighting them. We've got these terrifying figures that loom in our minds. We've got these fears and doubts and anxieties and worries, and they prey on us, and we feel as though we are grasshoppers before these problems. I've got them. I have personality problems that I can't fix. I know none of you will have spotted any of them, but nonetheless, I have them. I hide it well. I have a broken friendship that I don't know how to mend. I have doubts sometimes and fears, even about God at times, and the ecclesia, and my place in it, and with my brothers and sisters. And Moses is fighting, well, he's fighting age. He's very old at this point, and sheer terror. And over these sessions, we want to talk about giants, not just 13-foot monsters on distant battlements, but also the giants of today, because we're no different to Israel. We too face giants. FDR, the United States president who faced the Great Depression and Hitler's Third Reich, said, well, I think this is quite useful. Here's what he said. We have nothing to fear except fear itself. How we respond to the things we face is up to us. God said, and it was wonderfully quoted for us in our final prayer this morning in the memorial meeting, powers or things to come or things present or sword or violence or any other creature. On and on the list goes. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of Christ. We're more than conquerors, brothers and sisters. But we get really afraid, don't we? And in fighting giants, the problem isn't really the giant. Giants died like anyone else. Moses, an old man, proved that, and David and his stone proved that too. The problem with giants is they make us afraid. And God has an answer to that. He said it, fear not. And that sounds overly simplistic, doesn't it? And that's because it is oversimplistic. Come back to Deuteronomy 31, please, or forwards to Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy 31, verse 7. And Moses called unto Joshua and said unto him, in the sight of all Israel, be strong and of a good courage, for thou must go with this people into the land which Yahweh has sworn unto their fathers to give them. Thou shalt cause them to inherit it. And Yahweh, he it is that doth go with thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail you. He will neither forsake thee. Fear not. Don't be dismayed. Don't be afraid. Verse 12. Gather the people together, men and women and children, and the stranger within thy gates, that they may hear, that they may learn, and they may fear the Lord your God. Don't be afraid, he says. Don't be afraid, Joshua. Be afraid. Don't be afraid of them, but fear me. I think that's a contradiction, isn't it? But it was something that Moses really understood. He says, and all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, speak thou with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said to the people, fear not, for God has come to prove you that his fear might be before your faces, that ye sin not. And Moses understood that if we recall who God is and we bring to mind all the amazing things he has done to save us, our personal Red Sea moment, our personal victory at Rephidim, our miracle of the manna, the giants of fear, we will be overcome them. The New Testament gives us an example of exactly that sort of an experience. This is from Mark chapter 4. They were out on the ship and there was a great storm, and the storm threatened to sink the disciples. And they cry unto him, Master, don't you care that we perish? These sailors are dead afraid. And he arose and rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased and there was a great calm. And he said, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? Now the storm's gone. they fear exceedingly. They said to another, what manner of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. You see, reverence and awe will help displace our fear. For the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, isn't it? And when we learn the right sort of fear, it soon will be replaced by love that